of the Housing Commons Research Center, along with my colleague Nat Pace, the center's other co-lead, who's also here on the call with us today. Nat is also the director of the Canadian Network of Community Land Trusts. I'd also like to introduce Sam Carter-Shamai, the Housing Commons Research Center's research associate, who coordinates our webinar series and other initiatives, and who will also be facilitating this discussion today. So today's webinar, Exchanging Futures, International Perspectives on Housing Commons, explores how community-led and women-led housing is being built, protected, and transformed through international knowledge exchange, especially through partnerships between Rooftops Canada and Shelter and Settlements Alternatives as part of the Women's Spaces project in Uganda. The aim of the webinar is to highlight Ugandan-led expertise, ground the conversation on lived practices, and explore how reciprocal learning across international locations and beyond Western and Eurocentric models can strengthen a broader housing commons in the global context. So it's my pleasure to welcome and introduce our speakers today from both Canada and Uganda, who will be sharing their experiences with us and weaving together common threads through a discussion of their international partnership. And so we are working across time zones and again with an international group of folks on the call. So it's a pleasure to host this webinar today. And it'll be exciting to hear about everybody's experience with this international partnership, which is really significant. So first I'd like to introduce Geneviève Drouin. Geneviève is the CEO of Rooftops Canada, a Canadian nonprofit organization that works to improve housing and build sustainable communities in the global south through partnerships with local organizations as the international program of Canada's cooperative and social housing movement. Geneviève brings experience in cooperative housing, sustainable cities, and inclusive human settlements across Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, and Canada. Rooftops Canada is the executing agency for the Women's Spaces project between 2022 and 2027, which supports gender-responsive land rights and community-led housing in Angola, Kenya, South Africa, and Uganda. Geneviève has also generously assisted us with the envisioning and coordination of today's webinar. So thanks, Geneviève, for that. I'd like to also introduce Efemina Azuga. Efemina is a leader with a decade of experience advancing human rights, gender equity, inclusive governance, and housing justice. A lawyer by training, she bridges legal frameworks, strategic partnerships, and community-driven approaches to foster transformative and equitable systems. Currently, she's program manager at Rooftops Canada with a focus on land and housing rights and feminist programming. Next, I'd like to introduce Dorothy Baziwe. Dorothy is the Executive Director of Shelter and Settlements Alternative in Uganda. Dorothy is a social worker by profession and has been in the human settlement sector in Uganda since 2012. In this sector, Dorothy has engaged in various activities, including fundraising for housing projects, demonstrating housing development, advocacy and lobbying for responsive policies and programs, networking and collaboration with both state and non-state actors, as well as research and information sharing, all aimed at improved service delivery to vulnerable households in Uganda. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Peter Kasaija, and he is from the Urban Action Lab at Makerere University in Kampala, Uganda. Dr. Kasaija has extensive teaching and research experience over more than 15 years within the field of urban development and environmental change. His research interests include urban informality, urban environmental change and transitions, housing, inequality, poverty, and climate change adaptation and resilience. Also inclusive governance and planning. Dr. Kasaija has also been and continues to engage in various academic and research partnerships between Makerere University and different international institutions such as the Development Planning Unit at the University College of London, the UK, Tufts University in the US, and the University of Manchester in the UK. And last but definitely not least, Alia Abaya. Alia is a collaborative strategic leader with expertise in community development, social finance, sustainability, and cross-sector partnership building. Alia is the CEO of Circle Community Land Trust here in Toronto, where she is scaling a citywide nonprofit housing provider, building the organization from the ground up while stewarding the acquisition of 670 plus family homes and delivering a $72 million capital repair program that integrates building renewal with sustainability and long-term asset health to protect affordability in perpetuity. Alia has over a decade of leadership across the nonprofit and financial services sectors and has led community impact and member-focused portfolios spanning community investment, affordable housing financing, and complex stakeholder collaborations across national and international contexts. So welcome to all. It's really, again, a pleasure to be part of such a fantastic panel. So really excited to hear all the conversations we're going to be having over the next hour and 20 minutes. So just for the folks who have joined us, if you have joined us a little bit late, we are going to be organizing the panel in terms of having a discussion and a time for question and answer closer to the end. We'll have about 15 to 20 minutes at the end. So please do drop your questions in the chat as we go along. But first, I'd like to invite Geneviève and Efemina to provide an introduction to the work of Rooftops Canada and to the Women's Spaces Project. And then Sam will facilitate a discussion with Dorothy, Peter, and Alia about their work and experiences. And then we'll break into a session, a question and answer session or discussion session closer to the end. Okay, so Geneviève and Efemina, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. So good morning, good evening, everyone. It's great that we've been able to gather people from across time zones for this around the world. And thank you to Dr. Bunce for the introduction. And thank you for also to the Housing Commons Research Center and to Sam Carter-Shamai for coordinating the discussion and for bringing us all together. And thank you also to our Canadian and our Ugandan housing partners for joining us and for being part of this session today. As Susanna said, my name is Geneviève Drouin. I'm the CEO of Rooftops Canada, and Rooftops Canada is the international program for social and cooperative housing organizations in Canada. We were founded out of the Canadian co-op and social housing movement in the 1980s, and we continue to have significant support from the sector for our international work, as well as decades of partnership and support from the Government of Canada as well to build on the values and the strengths of Canada's co-op and community housing sector internationally. As an organization, we have more than 40 years of experience and partnerships in Africa and Asia, Latin America, the Caribbean, and in Eastern Europe. And we work very closely with the Canadian housing sector, both to share and to learn from our partners around the world. Our work is grounded in human rights principles. We are focused on promoting the right to adequate housing for all through community-led land and housing practices, through strengthening tenure security and building sustainable housing systems. And we know that the right to, securing the right to housing, especially for women who often face more significant barriers to tenure security, we know that that's foundational to achieving housing justice and economic inclusion and climate resilience. And so the Women's Spaces Project, which you'll hear more about from my colleague Efemina and also from our panelists today, it's a really powerful example of knowledge sharing in action and what's possible when community-based leadership and civil society organizations and global networks come together with a shared purpose to make land and housing more inclusive and more equitable and more just. And our model has always been based on knowledge sharing and co-learning between the Canadian housing sector and the partners that we work with internationally. So it's a very core part of the way that we work as an organization and with our partners. And so with that, I will hand it over to Efemina to share more about the Women's Spaces Project and what it is, who's involved, and some of the key achievements of the project so far with our partners in Sub-Saharan Africa, including those who are on the call with us today. So go ahead, Efemina.
Thanks, Geneviève. Good morning and good evening to our Ugandan partners. So the Women's Spaces Project is a 5-year co-funded project by Rooftops Canada and GAC, and it's implemented in 4 countries, Angola, Kenya, Uganda, and South Africa. So one of the things that the Women's Spaces Project thought about before its implementation is the fact that land and housing issues lie at the heart of women's poverty and insecurity in the countries that we work in. And we understand that when women have the opportunity to control land, to own land, to farm on land, then they're better able to protect themselves, provide for their families and respond to certain challenges such as sexual and gender-based violence, emergencies, natural disasters, right? And what the project saw before implementation is that there are certain laws and policies that exist thanks to the new urban agenda, to some positive constitutions in these countries. There are laws that exist to protect women. However, the implementation of these laws and policies continue to be a challenge. And that's why the Women's Spaces is delivering meaningful and valuable change to women and their households to ensure that they have equitable use of their lands and they can inherit it. So the Women's Spaces project is impacting the communities in three ways. The first is through strengthening national local laws to ensure that they're able to respond to women's needs such as inheritance, right to succession, the right to own lands. We're making sure that these laws are strengthened in a way that it benefits women as well as their household. The second way where the Women's Space is making huge impact is strengthening local practices through community-centered engagement, as well as engagement with CSOs and other relevant stakeholders, such as Peter, who's on the call today. He's a stakeholder on the Women's Spaces project. The third way is the Women's Spaces project is enhancing support and influence for gender-responsive laws regionally and internationally. So we work with key international partners like the Habitat International Coalition, the Housing and Land Right Networks, and the project also facilitates regional knowledge and exchange amongst partners in the sub-Saharan Africa and also with North American partners. And that's, why we're here today, right? To deepen that exchange. So I'm going to share a few impacts of the Women's Spaces project, and I'll start from Uganda. So the Women's Spaces project in Uganda is implemented in a way that community leaders, right, are trained to be paralegals to respond to disputes arising from land conflict, right? And so with the dispute resolution, you're training people to be paralegals, and these paralegals have resolved, lots of disputes, and you're working with different local councils and the police to ensure that these dispute resolutions are sustained. However, the project in SSA is also deepening tenure security by ensuring that women and vulnerable people have the right to their land secure. And this is through an STDM process. Currently, SSA through the Women's Spaces project has gotten tenure security for 309 people, and that's a huge number to us. As well as in Angola, very similar to what's happening with the STDM process in Uganda, 395 people have gotten secure tenure to their land. What this means is people can actually feel comfortable to make use of their land, to lease it out, to farm on it, and that gives them certain rights over the property. In Kenya, the partners in Kenya have been able to develop like a database system for urban agriculture where they're connecting all the farmers that work in Nairobi together in an app where they share challenges, lessons learned, and also use some feedback as research purposes in university. And in South Africa, last but not the least, partners in South Africa are, engaging with informal settlements, right? To understand the issues that concern them and advocate for those issues through the upgrading of Land and Rights Act, to make sure that the government is adequately aware of the issues of the informal settlement and they are responding to it. Partners have gone ahead to produce research papers that talk about the family home and informal settlements. I'll stop here for now. There are lots of impacts, but I'll stop here from now and, let the conversations flow. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ekamena and Geneviève, for the great introduction to Rooftops and to the partnership. Sam, I guess I can hand it over to you to facilitate or sort of introduce Alia and Dorothy and Peter more specifically, and then in terms of the conversation that you'll be facilitating. Thanks.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Dr. Glanz, for giving us wonderful intro, and for Geneviève and Efemena for really laying the groundwork about Rooftops Canada and the great programs that you all are running. Now, I want to get into the sort of discussion part of our conversation here. And so I will start with, again, just to sort of help transition us into things. One last question for you, Geneviève and Efemena, about how do you implement the approach to co-learning with your partners around the world and in Africa, in this case, particularly Uganda. As you see it, what do these reciprocal partnerships look like, not just as a theoretical exercise or in an ideal world, but on the ground in reality? How does this work in your experience?
Thanks, Sam. I'll start, and then Efemena, I'll hand it over to you to comment as well. So for us, the co-learning process, it always starts from a place of listening and seeking to understand. And, there are certain universal principles that we come to this work with. So, human rights, gender equality, housing justice, climate resilience. But we have to also always be aware that those universal principles don't have universal responses or solutions or pathways to achieving them. And so, what works in one place may work in another place, or it may look quite different. And so, part of our work is always being open to these new possibilities and different possibilities for achieving housing justice across cultures and across geographies. And so, what that means is that when we're sharing knowledge and learning, all of that is getting contextualized on all sides of the conversation. So, for example, when a Canadian partner is sharing their best practices or their lessons learned, it's being absorbed by a Ugandan partner, grounded in their own context and their own experiences, and vice versa. Canadian partners are doing the same. So, it's important that we're always maintaining an awareness of that, and that we're constantly checking our assumptions, that we're always asking questions in order for the kind of co-learning that we do to be as valuable as possible, and to avoid the likelihood of really valuable information and real solutions getting lost in translation. So it's that process of always being open and listening and seeking to understand and asking questions. Efemena, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, two things. The first is in order to sustain that reciprocity, we're ensuring that we're constantly learning from the local solutions, right? Because, for example, Canada, the way Canada in past decades has responded to housing crises is through the development and sustenance of co-ops, right? And we're sharing those lessons with the partners that we work with, as well as them share the practices that have worked for them. So this deepens that exchange and also builds the relationship. That's the second point. Building and sustaining relationships is one of the main focus of the Women's Spaces project, but generally of Rooftops Canada. We intend to facilitate this relationship. So even after project implementation, right, these relationships are still there, and both partners who collaborate can continue to exchange and advance housing rights globally.
Thank you both. I suppose it's worth asking on the participant side, Peter, Alia, Dorothy, do you have any thoughts in response to this sort of opening question about being in the programs and participating in these partnerships?
Hi, Sam. Dorothy here. I think I can go first. I think one of the most eye-opening being part of this program and being able to learn, but not only being able to learn from what Canada is doing, but actually being able to share and show what our African context is, what we are doing, how we are providing support to the communities that we work with, how we are making sure that we are articulating issues of land and housing, and how the different partners as a network under SSA come together to speak about these experiences. But also, I think it has been very valuable for us to learn what is happening in Canada, how a different context from ours is doing it, how advanced it is, the different steps that were taken in the beginning, and where the steps have taken the country to where it is right now. And appreciate also the challenges that continue to happen, because it's from challenges that we can learn how to structure ourselves better or how to improve the actions and interventions that we are trying to work on. I think that is my first response to that.
Great. Thank you. I think in so many things, it is through struggle, it's through the challenges that you actually get to learn and grow and progress. And so highlighting that off the jump is really important. Thank you. Aaliyah or Peter, do you have any thoughts as we open this up?
Yeah, I could just jump in with one more thing based on our experiences here in Uganda. And I think essentially it speaks to the issue of shared solidarity beyond the learning, that it's not just a question about us and them as women who are vulnerable or who are marginalized, but also ensuring that our own personal experiences are reflected in their own experiences. So we talk about our experiences when it comes to housing, as they also talk about their experiences, and we try to ensure that there is kind of like common ground, because it's one thing to speak in a condescending manner where you're coming from a point of privilege. You have access to housing, you have experience housing justice, you have all these things more or less, but they don't really have some of these things. But in spite of that, there are definitely challenges that we face. And I think it's important to create that space of building solidarities where they share their experiences, you reflect on on their experiences, in as much as you, as the implementers, also sharing your housing experiences, so that it becomes a relationship rather than simply a partnership of them and us. I don't know whether that kind of like speaks to the issue of shared solidarity, so that it doesn't create this artificial divide between us as the implementing partners and the community groups, the women groups that we're working with here in Uganda. Yeah, Sam.
I think that's stressing solidarity as like a fundamental principle, again, not just as an idea, but as a practice, as an action that is essential to this work is so important. So I really think that's a great point. Thank you for that.
Yeah, and I think that's such a large question for me and the experience. Like I'd say at a high level, one of the most impactful exchange pieces was like really seeing how social capital is such an important piece anywhere in the world, and the opportunity provided to me as a Canadian working in the Canadian context in affordable housing to connect with colleagues working on the same issues in Uganda and build that social capital between our countries was invaluable, because at Circle our practice is really local based, and we wouldn't have that opportunity otherwise, and that just provided an opportunity to like look at our work from an outside lens, and for me personally to really question my own practice and how we operate in extractive tendencies in our work at Circle. So that was, and there's so much more, but we can go to the other questions.
Yeah, well, no, I think that's why we wanted to start here. Obviously, these are big questions, but we take them a little bit at a time. And so I guess that leads really well into sort of the next question I wanted to ask, which is more explicitly about the exchange program and that experience of that you've already touched on of sort of operating in one's home context and then on the other side of this exchange. And so I guess this question is more explicitly for you, Aaliyah, and Dorothy, as the folks on this conversation who have participated in this exchange. I know I got the chance to meet you, Dorothy, when you were here touring the Kensington Community Land Trust. I guess that was just last spring, which was wonderful. And I'm so glad to be able to talk to you again. But I want to know now about what about these exchanges in particular, if there are particular memories or experiences that you return to, that you think about, that you take back home? How do you think about both perhaps the commonalities and the differences with respect to these different localities, and how do you like embody that exchange in your work and through as you go forward?
Thanks, Sam. Yes, it is really a pleasure to be talking to you again. From the visits that we had, I think some of the things that really stood out for us, the housing development cycle, how it is, the differences between the housing development cycle in Canada and the one in Uganda. When we talk about financing, that is the biggest part of the housing cycle that we are yet to really, if I could put it lightly, find a silver bullet. And it seems that we both don't have the silver bullet. One of the things is how far the government is vested in providing housing and providing infrastructure that is responsive to the needs of the community, the needs of the people. It was also interesting to see the different cooperatives, the levels that they are, how they're maintaining, how they're ensuring there's governance and there's continuity and there's that collaboration, focusing on priorities and principles like equity and inclusion, ensuring that everybody feels safe, feels involved and feels engaged. We are definitely liking the community land trust model because I think it's something that is very responsive to the level that Uganda is at, where we're trying to mobilize cooperatives, but we're looking at them from an angle of ownership, of partnership, but also orderly governance and growth with each other. And then also, one of the things that was really striking for me is technology. We have a bit of quite a difference between the adoption of technology in Canada versus that in Uganda. It's like in Uganda, we are so locked in on the old technology, and brick and mortar is what we know. But being able to expand our minds to think beyond just the brick and mortar and to encourage the real estate and the community members who have started embracing alternative building technologies, that was also a standout for me. So I think in terms of what really stood out for me, there's that. But there's also the part of ensuring that women participate in platforms. I cannot stress how important it is. For a long time, women in Uganda, women in Africa, have been left in the background or have been left out of conversations that are very important to land and housing development. And so being able to see women at the forefront, being able to see women engaged, being able to see them fight for themselves and know that what we are doing here is not only being done in Uganda, but it's being done world over. That was something that really stood out for me. Thank you, Sam.
Of course. So thank you for sharing. Some themes that I'm starting to pick up are already just about infrastructure, social care, capital, and solidarity. So I just wanted to sort of plant that seed because I'd like to return to that later. But maybe Aaliyah, as on the other side of the exchange, what do you think? Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I kind of alluded it already in my intro question, but like some of the things I experienced when I was in Uganda and visiting the colleagues in Kampala was like the level of community mobilization was immense. Like visiting the paralegal community in Mitiana and like seeing how it seemed less of a divide as sometimes like here in some of our work, and maybe this is just, depending on the size of your organization, but often we can like make the distinction between frontline and work that's happening in a different, higher level. But that seemed more equitable, the community work, and that was really inspiring and a lesson I think me especially, who sometimes in my role of an organization that is 25 staff, I can get removed from that. And so that was really insightful as a reminder. And I also, one of the first things I saw when I was in Kampala was like just the sheer abundance and opportunity. It was like we visited sites that they were looking to like develop eventually, and it was exciting to see the opportunity. But in that excitement, it really made me question how we do things in Canada and our own approach to development, which is like highly extractive. And are there ways that we could share and take a different approach, maybe in our models that put in guardrails to protect assets that now we've been through a period where we've lost some of those assets to the speculative market, and how can we move forward to protect them for affordable housing or agriculture, things like that.
I think you've touched on something that I find fascinating, and maybe I might ask you to just push you a little bit more on the extractive nature and of housing industry and that housing practice here in Canada. My experience through the Community Land Trust is that it's often seen as a bulwark against that type of extraction or an alternate model that shows that this is not the only way. But I mean, you're right in the thick of it. Could I get you just maybe speak a few more moments about that?
Yeah, I guess it was more a personal reflection, like when I saw so much opportunity and we were sharing ideas with our colleagues, like, oh, you could buy this, or you could develop this, or you could partner with the private sector, because that's how in Canada we often, partner government, private, and nonprofit together to actually be able to make a deal happen. But then I had to take a step back personally and think, is that, and actually question, is that really the way? Like, that's what we've made work here, but that's like based in a capitalist system that is, we're going along this pathway where we're trying to commodify an asset and make value out of it. And maybe there is an alternative route, through other systems where we change the value of a property. And it's more, First Circle, for example, we're looking like, how do you, since we're land trust and we can own the asset forever, how do we reframe that idea of like value and investing in an asset? And that really was something I came to from learning from my colleagues in Uganda and like seeing the work that they're doing with their co-ops and community building.
I think that's a really beautiful like framing, just the idea that we can question our assessment of value in these processes and in these operations. Again, it's something that I return to quite a bit in these conversations, that the track that we've been on is not necessarily by any means the only track that exists. And so just opening your eyes, your mind to a world of possible alternatives, other ways of conceptualizing and realizing value is hugely important. So I think that that's a great point. Peter, I want to bring you into this bit of the conversation as well, and I know that you've got a pretty wide-ranging perspective on a lot of these things, and again, very much grounded in the work in Kampala. How do you think about these exchanges, or maybe these ideas about challenging expectations around value or alternate approaches to partnerships and delivery and operations in this work?
I think they're really valuable, especially when, as Aliyah pointed out, when you realize that we really need to transcend the neoliberalist, capitalist analyses in terms of value, because that is what we're used to. But the thinking here is that through these exchanges, we can start a discourse, we can start a conversation around how do we conceptualize value from the ground up, from the grassroots, from the perspectives of those who are actually affected by issues around housing injustice. And of course, this actually takes me back to the key actors or the key stakeholders that we need to engage in these kinds of discussions around how we value real estate or how we value housing. Talking to the women savings groups, talking to the local fundis or the local building artisans who don't have any kind of like formal training or formal schooling, engineering skills. But by having the conversation with these people, given the kind of knowledge that they have that isn't accounted for in our formal literature, in our formal studies, that is not documented, engaging them and bringing them into this conversation, I think then we would be able to start that move towards new concepts, new models around how we analyze, how we assess value, moving away from the very capital centric or the neoliberalist kind of perspective, because it's the dominant model. And we realize that that kind of model, in terms of valuing real estate, valuing housing, just cannot get you that far in terms of the kinds of impacts we want to see or the impacts that we want to achieve. So it's about engaging those individuals who are not in the mainstream professional circles, who are not architects, who are not engineers, who are not real estate valuers, who are not surveyors, who are not sociologists, people who are simply engaged in the day-to-day issues around survival. Because even in that space of survival, their logics to the decisions that they make, their logics to the actions that they take. It is not simply them taking actions out of the blue or haphazardly, but their logics to the way they make their decisions, their logics to the way they take action. So we need to understand those logics and create a conversation that would then help us come up with an alternative way of approaching value, how we value real estate, how we value land, how we value housing, because that is the only way I think we would definitely be able to address some of the critical issues that we are looking at. That conversation with those who are outside the mainstream system that determines what is value, how do we value, by bringing them into the conversation and then generating new models or new concepts, new approaches of how we value land and housing. And I think that could possibly yield some significant results in that aspect of meeting the kinds of needs that we're trying to address in this context. Yeah, Sam, over to you.
Thank you. No, that's really fantastic offering. And again, it's bringing me back to the very beginning of the conversation and the very value of these exchanges to to not even speak metaphorically, but to put someone out of their regular day-to-day, even that simple gesture starts to open up this world of possibilities. And when the intent of that exchange is to open up one's worldview, you begin to, as Aaliyah was saying, question the things that you take for granted in our own day-to-day. My experience as a planner here, so much of our conversation about value is about the market value, the exchange value, and not so much what we use these things for, not so much, as you say, about the survival, the joy, the family life, the relationships that are facilitated by stable housing. As Dorothy was pointing out, the importance of having women on the forefront and participating in this work is not, doesn't equate to a financial value, but there is so much intrinsic worth in recognizing that. So I really thank you all for touching on these pieces as we go here. Yeah, it's so much of our conversation in Toronto, as I've been taught as a planner in planning schools, it's about the highest and best use of a piece of land. And I'm always frustrated by that because no, we're really just talking about the highest monetary value. We're rarely talking about the best thing to do with this land. And I think that this is all sort of helping us reframe that equation at the least. Anyways, I want to move on to the next piece, which again, I think we're already starting to get into. But this is more about, again, the infrastructures that you've all sort of made some allusion to, and whether that is the soft infrastructures of governance or the infrastructure of social capital that is at play in all of these works. What does it take to actually build and foster these cultural, legal, political structures that, again, provide the backdrop, the support and foundation for the work that we're all doing in community-led housing efforts? Um, I don't know if anybody wants to jump in or.
I'm happy to jump in from a partnership perspective, because that's the focus of our work. Is really, I often think about it as like patient partnerships, similar to patient capital, where we commit to being in this together over the long term rather than just chasing quick wins, and that takes a really deep respect for partnerships that are rooted in place, that are rooted in community, and that seek to understand each other. And anyone who's been in this work for in the affordable housing sector knows that none of this happens overnight, right? And in housing, it's often the small wins and the cumulative wins. So more secure tenure, an organization that's now stronger, women who are leading processes, maybe a policy shift. These small and cumulative wins are what eventually lead to the bigger wins and lead to the more large-scale impact and the systemic change that we're looking for. The challenge, I think, is that long view can be really hard to sustain in a sector that's dominated by short-term project-based funding, as we very much are, where organizations, we're constantly pursuing the next grant just to keep going. And so the long view, it can be challenging, but it's also vital. And I mean, there are structures, if we look at the community land trust model, for example, that do take that long view and that aren't subject to the sort of short-term grant funding that organizations, civil society organizations, and the NGO sector often are. I think that the value of civil society partnerships, especially across borders, it's easy to get kind of insular and to look at our own communities and our own, local systems, which is really important. But I think that, the value of civil society partnerships across borders also can't be overstated. Because when systems fail, when governments, government priorities shift, when funding flows shift, and that can happen overnight, it's often the strength of civil society, and it's these partnerships and those relationships of trust that we have built over time, often over decades, that keep these solutions moving forward and that keep that knowledge alive and that sustain movements regardless of the politics and the funding flows of the day. And so, one of the things I've learned after decades of working in civil society and in the NGO sector is that our relationships are what help us weather that uncertainty that comes with this work. And I think it's important to state that the trust we have in each other and the effort that we put into building that trust is not trivial, right? It's often really deeply and institutionally embedded. And it, meaning that it can survive changes in staff, it can survive changes in leadership, and it becomes a form of infrastructure in its own right, that trust that we have and the work that we do together. And it really is, I think it's essential to sustaining progress in community-led housing. So yeah, those are my thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Peter,
If
go
I
ahead.
can jump in there
Yes.
quickly, Sam. Yeah, in addition to what she has spoken about, the partnerships. My point seems obvious, but then when you go deeper into it, you realize the benefits of positive pedagogical exchange. I mean, universities are very important spaces for learning, stimulating ideas, students, planners, architects, and all these other professionals, future professionals, built environment professionals. And traditionally, what we've been used to is students moving out of the classrooms and visiting communities, having these exposures, and all these kinds of what we sometimes call academic gymnastics, which we think to a certain extent are very extractive and very one-sided. So the thinking here is that bringing the local knowledge, the knowledge of women in these communities, in these cooperatives, in these neighborhood groups into the classroom. For example, in the Urban Action Lab, we've been talking about what we call community professors, where we have sessions or seminars where we essentially bring in people from informal settlement communities, women, men, youth, to speak to students, to inspire them, and to share their experiences that we as teachers or instructors cannot really share in class, or stuff which you cannot really learn from the books or the texts that are shared in class. So the thinking here is that pedagogy can definitely be transformed, the way we train, the way we teach, the way we prepare future professionals, by bringing these communities, these actors, the women, the youth, and all these other marginalized groups that we're working with into the classroom, into the teaching space, so that they can inspire and trigger a new way of thinking in terms of how these future professionals approach development issues, urban development issues such as housing justice, resilience, poverty, inequality, and the like. So for me, in addition to the partnerships, I think it's kind of like an extension here to partnerships where we're looking at communities being brought into the universities, into the teaching spaces, the training spaces, so that they can transform the way future development professionals think and approach issues such as housing justice, housing poverty, and inequality. Yeah. So.
Oh, absolutely. And again, I think this is just continuing that theme of challenging our assumptions as what has value. It's not merely experience, but it is expertise, expertise of life, expertise of survival, as you say earlier. Dorothy, please go ahead.
Thanks, Sam. I just wanted to look at it also from the political side of it. I think, as Geneviève had said, the partnerships are very important across the board, across the bar. One of the things that this study and exchange visits brought to our forefront is we haven't engaged our government a lot beyond the advocacy where we speak to them. But we, and thanks to Rooftops for this, we attempted to also show them. SSA was able to travel with some government officials to have that exchange, not only from them hearing or being told or being given advocacy papers and that kind of thing, but to actually show lived experiences. For example, I think there was one of the examples where an institution is using housing as a health outcome. How do you reduce the impacts of diseases and all by providing housing? And that was something that was really phenomenal for our political side of it, for our policymakers to see that actually their investment in housing is not only unlocking community potential, is not only unlocking the economy, but is actually also feeding different outcomes. So I think that one was also a great thing. Talking about flexible financing, because I think for years, as we've been doing advocacy in housing, we've been saying the state must provide, but we've not been showing the state how we can all be partners in this, how we can all play a role. So seeing it from the side of Canada, that it's not exactly only money that the state would be willing to invest in, but also give guarantees, also give some tax support, being able to unlock and drive down the cost of housing. That is also something that has come out of this nature of events. The thing that I wanted to say that is a bit different is that in Uganda, as Peter has said, we do a lot of self-building. So that really brings a lot of the informal sector at play, which is something that we did not see a lot of in Canada. But it also kicked us off thinking, how can we innovate around the partnerships where the academia comes in and works with the informality and bridges the gap between informality and government institutions. So that is also structure building kind of initiative that can help to improve the community-led housing in Uganda. Thank you.
Of course. No, thank you. I think you brought up a bunch of really great points, and the one that is sort of sticking in my mind is, if I can sort of turn it around a little bit, is that so many of the levers that are available don't necessarily have a directly linear or one-to-one outcome. And if you can start to articulate how a given or assumed action actually has mutual benefit for a whole bunch of different communities, a whole bunch of different perspectives, then you can start to see action that gets us to a new place, to a different outcome. Aaliyah, do you have anything to add in this?
Yeah, I would just add that I think and a great example of the infrastructure for the housing sectors is this webinar specifically, like being it like when we were visiting our colleagues, like we were so immersed in the day to day and like absorbing all the information and toying around, but we didn't often have time to like step back and have a dialogue about with difficult questions like these. So having that opportunity provided now is incredible because I'm listening to the answers and it's also triggering more, and then being able to like share that publicly with the broader housing audience and non-housing too. I think that's actually building that web and infrastructure in the sector internationally, which is amazing.
Absolutely. I think about this so much, not just in the context of these webinars, but I think it's part of the progress trap that we're in, that we're always trying to go forward, which means that we never have a chance to even think about what it is that we've done or where we've come from. And that, again, how are we supposed to learn if we don't even take a second to pause, reflect, exchange with each other? So, I mean, that's what
Yeah,
we're here for.
that's the cool stuff.
Yeah. And it's great to be able to carve out some time with you all to hear from you, because you guys are the ones who are so deeply involved in all of this right now. So, you know, thank you all for being here to share. I've got a couple more questions, but I just wanted to remind folks that if you have a question of your own, we'll have a Q&A shortly. You don't need to sit on it. If a thought comes to mind, just throw it in the Q&A chat down there so we can come to it later. Okay, but my next question, again, these are related questions. I think we've already started to get towards this, but if you could put it in a word, and I want to hear from everybody on this. If you could sort of try to distill it to a thought, an idea, a couple sentences. How do we sustain these relationships, and how do we exchange this knowledge sharing beyond a particular exchange program? Geneviève, you spoke to the necessity of the civil service to be able to sort of hold that long-term view and also celebrate the short-term, the small wins. How do you straddle these timescales, and how do we sort of live in these sustained relationships and sustained trust building exercises? Um, could I maybe, not to put anybody on the spot here, but Efmena, I would love to hear from you about this.
Yeah, I was actually going to speak. So there are two things that stand out for me, and the first is accountability, and the next is transparency, right? In building and sustaining these relationships, transparency is most valued, right? Is how these exchanges are being used, right? We've had these exchanges, they're currently going on in the project, but how are the partners embedding, different contextual experiences? Like, how are they using it to benefit their own systems? How are they engaging differently? How are they, enlarging the stakeholders that they're consulting with, right? And by embedding all of the exchanges, they're able to share transparently if it's actually working or if it's not working. And one of the things that the project cares a lot about is localization, right? So we're not you must ensure that whatever exchange you're using is going to be implemented. No, we want it to spark conversations. We want it to spark, local thinking within the community. We want it to be, people-centered and, continuous sharing of, what is working, what is not working is contributing to the larger scale of conversations, and discussions on housing justice. Next is accountability. And I feel like this is in both sides. And when we engage housing actors, right, it's in form of advocacy, right? Um, but then again, there's the need to turn around and hold certain people to account because regardless of the fact that we all work on the table, we're equal partners. There are some people that have more power dynamics, the people that provide like that funding, and we need to hold them account because your taxpayers' money, right? This is the government that is providing that coverage for you because you're responding to your obligations as a citizen. So it's the ability to, learn different ways, different contexts, are holding stakeholders, actors to account, and sharing all of that as well. Because, what is working for them will probably work for us, and what's working for us would, probably work for them. Yeah.
Beautifully put. Transparency and accountability. And again, it gets back to that idea of being able to reflect on the actions taken, the progress made so far. Thank you. I'm really so happy. This conversation is going really well, and I'm loving it. I do want to hear from everybody, and we've got just a couple minutes left on our time before we get to Q&A. I am seeing some more questions come in there. So please just let's jump in here. I don't know. Maybe
Sam?
yes, go ahead, Dorothy.
Yeah, I think I'm just riding along with what FMN has said. One of the aspects that I think was and still is very great for me is that these conversations can actually build something. So there's that part of where we take part in webinars, in workshops, where we can clearly articulate the issues and the challenges at hand and see how to build around them together with the different stakeholders across the bar. So my proposal would be to continue having workshops and experience exchanges like storytelling, experiential sharing, webinars, podcasts, and that kind of thing to keep the conversation going based on coming up with solutions or coming up with joint actions, interventions, advocacy asks, and so on. Thank you.
Another beautiful
So,
thought.
Sam, I'm just going to come again because Dorothy said something
Yeah.
that I thought about closely, and it's still on the exchange, right? But more focused on the pedagogy of the exchange, right? So we do exchange, or so we do engagements in different ways, which is great. We're engaging actors, stakeholders, different communities, but the methodology, the way we engage people, it's different from context to context. And one of the things we've seen with our Women Spaces partners is that, they have individual ways of engaging stakeholders. You see, a partner is probably doing lots of artistic expressions to get the attention of certain, stakeholders. SSA is doing storytelling. They're doing, making skits. You see another partner doing a very immersive, training session. So it's not just about what we're doing, it's how we're doing it that actually leads us to the what, right? The real impacts that we want to see. So I feel like the knowledge and sharing, especially on the way that the partners achieve purpose, achieve impact, is so important to sustaining that relationship.
Couldn't say it better. I was going to touch on the same thing, but I think you got it. I really want to hear from Peter and Aaliyah before we go. So maybe Peter or Aaliyah, you've unmuted. You go ahead.
Sure. I would just add that I think it would be like everything that everybody has said, I agree. And I think to add, it would be valuable to also share our conversations and experiences with different sectors, because often, like maybe to the private sector or working with developers or like other people who don't have access to this kind of community or knowledge or background, like it could really be eye-opening and they could bring a lot to the conversation as well.
Well, on that note, I'll just remind folks that we are recording this conversation so that we can share it afterwards with people who aren't here, who aren't necessarily in our typical housing circles. So just a little plug. Peter, give us a last word before we go on to Q&A. And Geneviève, of course, if you have a thought too.
Yeah, this is again, it's kind of like common sense. It's related to what Aliyah was talking about. Again, I think it also touches on the issues of accountability, transparency. It's the issue of communication. Whom do we communicate and how do we communicate our messages? How do we put across these messages? Because, for example, Aliyah talks about communicating to a wider audience beyond this very closed space of the women groups that we're working with, the cooperative communities that we're working with, but widening the net so that these experiences, this learning, the sharing that we have accumulated over time, this knowledge is able to percolate into these other channels that we possibly could harness other potential opportunities and possibilities. So I think it goes along with the issue of transparency, the issue of accountability. For me, communication is really key. And it's not just about the way we are communicating or how regularly, how consistently we are communicating with the groups that we're working with, but these other potential stakeholders or actors, the business community, all the kinds of actors that we think might not really have a direct bearing on housing, because we normally talk about how small actions having very large impacts and small actions also having unintended consequences. We talk about spin-offs, and through these spin-offs, there are possibly other actors that we can bring into the conversation if our communication strategy is really spot on in this context. Yeah. Sam, over to you.
Beautiful. Thank you. And Geneviève, any last thoughts to close the round table?
Just one final comment to reinforce the piece about communications that we who are very engaged in this work see the value of this kind of exchange and this kind of sharing and the reciprocity that comes from knowledge flowing in both directions like this. What we have not been very good at doing historically is communicating the value of that to other audiences. And so, getting outside of the, non-traditional groups that we tend to speak to, and really engaging, I think, from our perspective as a Canadian NGO, engaging the Canadian public about the value of this kind of work is an ongoing challenge for us. And as Efemena mentioned, the Women's Spaces Project in particular is funded by Global Affairs Canada, so it is a government-funded project, and it's important that we are sharing the impacts of this work with the Canadian public as well. And so it's something we need to get better at doing, and it's always been a challenge for us to get that message across and get it across to the right groups of people.
Well, thank you all for sharing your thoughts and reflections with us. The thought that is sort of sticking with me now is, I think, the piece that Dorothy mentioned. It's not just what we do, but how we do it. And so I'm so grateful for all of you for so graciously sharing your thoughts and reflections with us here today. I'm gonna go now to our Q&A, and I see a couple questions here. So to start from the top, this is from Manish, and they're asking, how can housing market analysis be made participatory and gender inclusive so that they better identify affordability challenges, supply gaps, and future housing demand? So this is really, I think, a question about our methods and approaches, again, not just that what, but the how.
I mean, I would add the land trust model is a good example because it starts with often with the community that's vulnerable. And so it's starting from a place of the people who have the information and are seeking a solution. For example, Circle's founding was started by tenants who were at risk, and they banded together to advocate and then pulled in the supporters that they knew they needed, like government officials, housing advocates, to like help advance the goal of protecting and saving the houses.
I think that this story gets to this underlying message here that there is experience, that is expertise, and the trick is about how do we translate that for the different audiences that need to hear it, whether that's a government audience or a private sector audience or a community audience. It can be the same message, just delivered differently to have maximum strategic effect. Any other thoughts about the uh, like how to make these processes more participatory? I think that Efemena and Dorothy, your comments about like storytelling, creative practice as not like separate from but essential to this type of work, that's something that's really interesting to me. And I'd be curious to hear if you could share more thoughts about how that experience has played out in your respective work.
Thanks, Sam. I think I'll jump in before I can hand over to Efemena. One of the things that the Women's Spaces Project has really leaned on as an intervention is supporting community paralegals. So this is a group of community members who are not really educated and trained in the law, but are given the basic education of what the law says, how to interpret it, and how to use it. And then they go into the communities and they're able to do peer-to-peer support of other women who are more trusting because of the fact that you have built that trust by empowering a community person. So I think the way to ensure that there's participatory analysis of the housing context is to ensure that the people that you are the people that you're sending into the community are able to understand, they're able to articulate, they're able to explain to both sides what the challenges are and how the community feels they would want these challenges to be addressed. And once they're able to bring that to us and articulate it, then we're able to review it as a network and form policy positions that we then take to the duty bearers. So I think that is how to ensure that you engage in a participatory process by working with community members who can actually reach out to the other community members. Thank you.
Dorothy, you forgot to hand. Sorry. Sorry. Dorothy, you said you were going to hand over to me.
You. I'm so sorry.
Okay, so I have three thoughts. The first way that we're ensuring participatory practices is enabling the communities, these people who we're serving, to speak for themselves, right? Oftentimes, because we're the ones, organizing the project, we have partners, and then it tends to, their voices tend to be in the messaging, but not they don't get seen, right? When the message is being delivered. And so that's one of the things that the Women's Spaces Project is doing, is ensuring that we're getting the people to speak, right? You have Peter here. He's one of the stakeholders. He's speaking to it. He's not directly, working in SSA. We have several videos, several, messaging from I don't want to use beneficiaries, but community members who have been involved in the Women's Spaces Project. And I think that is very important to make them understand that their voices are important, they are heard, they are seen, and their views are taken into decision-making processes. The second one is targeting messaging. And Sam, I think you talked about this, and it got me thinking about the way we message in South Africa on the women's spaces and the way we do our messaging in Uganda. It's quite different. So in South Africa, there are certain ways that they communicate to their audiences, which are the community members, or like the registry of Ministry of Deeds, or the legislative arm. They twerk the messages a bit. So you would see for a particular executive arm of government, they're providing policy briefs, but to the communities, they're providing things like fact sheets where they extract those information into bits and pieces where they could understand and engage. They're also providing pathways for people to ask questions or to, engage in the process. And this is key because not one way of, putting the work we do would work for every audience. And I'm glad that the Women's Spaces Project implementation partners understand this and are also responsive to the ever-changing, fluidity. The third one is the importance of leveraging relationships. So at different levels, people have, it's a web, right? Relationships upon relationships. And one of the things that we continue to encourage is for people like, Peter, what are some relationships that you have that can be important, right, in this discourse? And also, ensuring that you understand that the world is moving, it's fast-paced right now. Most governments are focused on trade and then development, right? And it's how we're bringing those trade partners, those trade actors into the conversations, because who knows, they may be the ones that have the capital to, run through the work that we're doing to sustain it, right? And so they are constantly sharing these networks that they have, the partnerships that they have. And I feel like that's a huge way that we can ensure that our practices or, interventions remain participatory.
Peter, you were about to say something. Thank you, FMN. I think that's like such an important piece. It makes me think of like code switching and the importance of having people with lived experience to be able to speak to both sides of the question. But please go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, I was just adding something to Dorothy's submission about the paralegals that they have been working with as SSA. The other dimension of working with paralegals as a way of, or as a mechanism of having more participatory approaches to to address the issue of inclusive housing is not only them acquiring this vital knowledge about, for example, uh, legal tools, legal instruments, and passing on this knowledge to communities. But I think the other important dimension that they come with in this particular context is the issue of identifying with the communities themselves. The communities can better identify with these actors. So it's not just the message, it's not just the knowledge. I think the knowledge sinks in better if the one who's sending the knowledge or the messenger is able to identify with the community that he is engaging with. And I think that's a very important aspect that we have to keep an eye on in terms of successful or more impactful participatory approaches to dealing with the issue that we are looking at here. Yeah, so.
Thank you. And I'm sorry, I'm just keeping an eye on the questions that keep on coming in here, and as well as trying to keep an eye on the clock. So there's three more questions and more. Um, um, and I want to make sure that we can at least get to all of these. So I'm going to read out these three questions and then maybe pass it back to you all. Maybe well let's see what we've got here. So on the one hand, Earl is saying they're deeply appreciative of the international cross collaborative opportunities, especially with Canada and African countries, and asks, are there opportunities to collaborate beyond once the funding of the rooftop projects come to an end? And then we have another question here, simply asking about collective land tenure models supporting access to housing, and what do these look like? For example, asking about land trusts or cooperative ownership. And then the final question that I've got here, I just want to bundle all these together and we can try and respond to them as a group with these last few minutes. Justice is saying that there's a lot of knowledge and innovation that these spaces offer. However, the challenge has been getting key actors like the government, especially in Uganda or African context, to act on this information. And I would say it's hard to get a Canadian government to act on this stuff too, but that's just my thought. To act on this information and deliver tangible housing delivery to our focus groups, to our target groups. How do we navigate this conundrum? And so with those thoughts, I pass it back to you for some closing thoughts before we totally run out of time here. And apologies that we can't just keep this conversation going because there's so much to say.
Perhaps I can. Oh, go ahead, Alia. Okay. I can jump in, starting from Justice's question around how do we get certain actors like government interested or to act on the information that we're generating from the kind of work we're doing. One of the strategies that we have started with in some of the work we've been doing as SSA, SSA is part of what we call the Urban Informality Working Group. And one of the ways that we're trying to deal with this particular challenge is to informally engage with specific actors in government, with specific policymakers or individuals who we think we can have a conversation with. And once we start that conversation with them, there are possibilities of transforming the way they think, the way they respond, and broadly speaking, how they can use the levers of power available or accessible to them towards getting the government to respond to this information. Traditionally, we've always thought it's about the formal spaces through which we engage these actors. I mean, preparing policy documents, preparing white papers, and all that stuff. But I think we've realized that there's only so much those formal spaces or those formal channels can achieve in terms of our long-term objective of actually getting government to act on this knowledge and this information that we are bringing. So it's about employing as many creative, innovative ways of engaging actors. And I think one of the ones that we found that could be useful in terms of new possibilities, opportunities of getting government to act is informally identifying certain actors, engaging these actors, having the conversation with these actors, and nudging them. The thinking is through these small steps, there are possibilities of pushing them and nudging them towards bringing the larger institutions, the policies, the levers of power accessible to them to respond to the kinds of issues we're trying to deal with. Yeah, over to you, Sam.
Oh, thank you. I was just going to pass it right over to Aaliyah. I want to hear from as many as you in our last moments as possible.
Yeah, I was just gonna, it's very similar to Peter's comment. I think what really I was impressed with in Uganda was, everywhere Dorothy and Brian would lead us was like so obvious that the social capital that the team at SSA held was a huge part of how they advanced the work, and like their networks and the trust they had built, their reputation was so highly regarded. And I think it is very similar to what we see in Canada, is like a lot of the advancement is made by those relationships and the reputation of the people involved. And so to Peter's point, like identifying key individuals and building trust in those relationships does have a lot of weight, building that social capital to advance projects with government.
Well, so I wanted to, I think this is a radical opinion, right? And that's because we do relationship buildings, we do it the formal way, and sometimes you see it works, but sometimes it takes longer to work, right? And we need the government to be actively involved. And so I'm going to say, like, you know, we bet them. Literally, it's like if you don't, get involved in issues that concern the people when it comes to land and housing rights, if you're not actively budgeting for cooperative housing or affordable housing, then we're not going to vote for you. It's literally like an uprising, right? I'm not saying like uprisings are the way to go, but you look at Kenya, right? There was a tax reform law that the government was proposing, and then the people who actually vote for the government are like, if you go ahead with this, we're not going to vote for you. So sometimes we need to take some radical stance against lackadaisical behaviors or attitudes towards collective good. And I'd also say social audits have proven very useful in the last decade, where CSO groups like SSA come together to help the government distill what the budget is being used for, track it, and provide some recommendations, which is something that the government is, they do, maybe not on a large scale, but organizations have been able to do lots of social audits, which brings to light all of the things that the community members who are probably not well enlightened should be focusing on as they make their demands.
If I could just jump in here, I agree with everything that's been said, and I'm going to just briefly touch on the question around opportunities for collaboration beyond the project end date. And so this current project that we're talking about now is the Women's Spaces project, and it does end in March 2027. So it does have an end date, but we've been doing this work for 40 years, and the partnership model and the trust-based, trust building in the way that we work is a really core part of everything that we do. And so we will continue this work, and we will find other ways of funding it. And when a project ends, we continue to build on that work, right? So the project that comes after this project will build on the work that's being done in the Women's Spaces project. And I think it goes back to that piece that I was saying before about how the trust building is a part of the infrastructure in and of itself, right? That when we've taken the time to build that, that the end of a project and the end of a funding cycle, ideally that it can withstand those changes and those ups and downs.
And Dorothy, please.
I just wanted to build from what Geneviève just said. And I really think it's about having more experience exchanging in different models. It doesn't always have to be structured under a project, but to continue the conversation going. And I really appreciate you, Sam, and the whole team here, Dr. Burns, for bringing us together in this. I think this should be a continued thing where we continue to exchange ideas, initiatives, and innovations. So that is how the project lives beyond its life for me. Thank you.
Beautiful. Well, on that note, as we're approaching the hour, first of all, most importantly, I want to thank all of you, Aaliyah, Dorothy, Peter, Geneviève, Efemena, for joining us, bringing all of your reflections and your insights to this conversation. Deeply, deeply appreciative of this conversation and, of course, more conversations to come. As always, thanks to Dr. Bunce and Nat Pace, who helped lead this little effort to bring these conversations to the table. And so I guess just in closing, I will again reiterate that please share this recording with folks who you think would be interested, who want to hear it, who don't typically hear these types of things. Share it with everybody. And we will have more. Our next webinar in February will be a bit of a deeper dive into the similar theme about the differences, comparing, contrasting different contexts, but will be more specifically about CLTs, community land trusts in Canada, across Canada and across the world. So I'm looking forward to getting those details out. So please keep an eye out for that. And then in the meantime, again, in this theme of keeping conversation going, we were going to be restarting our student circle, our ongoing learning circle, which is meant to be a sort of more casual space for a more fluid discussion to reflect on some of the themes that came out of this conversation. So we'll be putting invites out for these events in the next month as well. I think that is about all that I've got. As always, ask everybody to stay tuned, keep talking to each other. Appreciate you all, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, whether that is leading into the midday here in the Toronto time zone or into your evenings over in Kampala. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.